The combat controllers do a couple of different things. Like anybody else in special ops, they have these foundational skills, the ability to shoot and move in small teams and infiltrate by most methods, parachutes, submarines, diving, whatever. But what really separates them from the rest of special ops is their expertise and the level of sophistication with which they can apply air power to a battle space, whether it's a point on the mountain or a broader set of topography or geography that people are contesting. These guys can provide air power, which is really what brings disproportionate devastating effects to a battlefield. And their communication skills are just better than those of their peers that they integrate with. What's odd about combat control from an individual standpoint is the fact that you train as a team. It's even called combat control teams. That's what they are. But you never deploy together with your teammates. What happens is I get farmed out to a SEAL platoon or Special Forces ODA or the Australian SASR, and you go into that community as a one-man show who provides this expertise. It's a really unique way to go to war and experience combat, and that's what I did. That's what the book Alone at Dawn is about. John Chapman was a combat controller, the Air Force's only Medal of Honor since the Vietnam War, and nobody knows about us, I should say. I tend to think about him in the third person because I've sort of become an unofficial voice and face for combat control. But that's a sad state because these are some of the most lethal people to walk a battlefield in the history of human warfare.
And that's exactly what we're going to get into right here, right now. And that's why I'm so excited to be talking to you of all people. Now, were you a member of the 24th? I believe it's called the STS. That's
Yeah,
their so that's their tier one. So you have like tier two combat controllers. Correct me if I'm wrong. And then you have the
yes.
24th STS, and those are like that's their tip of the spear guys.
That's the
Correct?
Air Force's version of SEAL Team 6 or Delta Force.
Gotcha.
And then, and so, and it resides in that same space and community as those other entities. And, so I spent a lot of my career at that organization or in that community, which is really another way to divide that. And this may make sense to people. That's black special ops. White special ops are what you think of as regular SEALs or special forces teams or uh, regular combat controllers. No, none of these people are regular. I don't mean to diminish anybody's capability, but there's a big differentiation between how they get fielded and how they get funded between white and black special ops.
Yeah, that's a great way to explain it. Makes perfect sense. So I want to go into Somalia. How do you end up attached or, like you said, farmed out? Who were you attached to going into Somalia in '93?
Well, you have to go back 92 when all this started to unfold and the US was trying to wade into a country that was coming apart and trying to stabilize the situation in order to prevent starvation. To me, that's America at its best. That's what America does to a greater extent for the rest of the planet than any other nation. Now you have to fast forward into 1993, and there's clan fighting, factional fighting inside Somalia, in particular Mogadishu, which is a city of 1 million people. And it was quadrants, really. It was divided into 4 different sections by 4 different clans. The Haber Getter clan was run by a guy named Mohammed Farah Adid, and he was hijacking food and using it as a weapon as his campaign to try and attain dominance in the city. So the U.S. decides they're going to hunt this guy down and neutralize him as a detriment to stabilization. When it finally comes down the pike, it's going to go to Delta Force. Delta Force was going to lead the manhunt. So when this came to Delta Force, I was actually on alert. I was working at Delta Force. Like I mentioned earlier, my job is to go plug in with somebody else. And I spent a lot of my career working at that unit in particular. So I was one of the original planners for that mission. We prepped, we rehearsed, we even loaded a plane once. We're sitting on the ramp with the engines running to deploy to Somalia when they pulled the plug. That's a typical experience for guys in black ops. You're going to go somewhere, you're not going to go somewhere. You're going to go somewhere, you're not going to go somewhere. Well, we didn't go anywhere. The spring of 93 came and went, and we swapped out. It was a new Delta Force squadron. It went from B squadron to C squadron, and it went from a different team at the 24th STS. So I handed it off to 2 teammates of mine. A guy named Jeff Bray, who did deploy, was one of those guys. But in the summer of 93, right before we deployed, I was no longer on the mission. I was out, like a lot of guys, and all of the Rangers that deployed. So if you interviewed some Rangers. They had this experience. We're in Texas somewhere, I don't remember where, doing a readiness exercise, and I'm doing recon missions with some Ranger RRD guys. And middle of the night, this is before cell phones. All we really had was beepers, but when you're deployed, we didn't even take beepers. Someone came and roused me out of my rack about 2 o'clock in the morning and said, "Hey, you got to get on a plane and go back to Fort Bragg." That's a good sign for a guy like me, because that means you're going to do something. So I go back, and they recalled me because I was one of the original planners for the deployment to go to Somalia for my unit. The other guys had already come in, but my boss said to me, "Go back over to Delta Force, get yourself a job." I'm like, "I don't think there's any jobs over there for this mission." But we brought the Rangers into the fold, and I ended up plugging in with the Rangers. So I didn't deploy as part of, we're all one task force. Task Force Ranger is what it was called. And the reason it was called Task Force Ranger was an OPSEC sort of obfuscation, so people would think it was just Rangers. Back then, Delta Force was still very secret. People didn't know much about Delta Force, and no one knew about the 24th Special Tactics Squadron. So if we all got high and tight haircuts like Rangers and shaved off our Chuck Norris mustaches and beards that we used to sport, people might think we were Rangers, and that was the deployment. So I actually got a high and tight Ranger haircut right before I deployed. And that's how we all went to the war, or the campaign in Somalia. And my job as a combat controller was to be that air power and communications integration capability for the Rangers on the ground in Somalia. And the other main component of conducting raids was run by Delta Force, who led the missions. And that's where my friend, really good friend Jeff Ray, was plugged in with Delta Force's C Squadron.
So when you guys are taking off to go to Somalia, do you know that this is going to be like a direct action type situation? Or is it,
Oh, yeah.
we're going to get, so you're going, like the peacekeeping mission is now over. This is
No.
now a direct, oh, okay.
The United Nations operations in Somalia, UNISOM was the acronym. This was now UNISOM 2, the second iteration. They're still there to try and stabilize things. That's what the United Nations is supposed to do, and try and keep warring factions from fighting each other. So there were peacekeepers still there. But you're correct. That was not our job. Our job was to go to Somalia and hunt down some of these key leaders who were being so disruptive, and acquire those people and turn them over to the United Nations. There's actually a U.S. ship off the coast that we would, if we capture guys, we'd send them over there. And then where it went in the UN process, man, that's not my problem. I'm a staff sergeant and combat controller. What the hell do I care? But the fact is, to your point, we're going to a city of 1 million people that's been experiencing a civil war for 2 years at this point. Everybody's armed. There's a lot of desperate people. Subsistence living is the rule of the day. And we're going right into these armed militias to hunt people down. It was definitely a direct action mission, and we had prepared for that to the best that we could back then. What was interesting in the event was we relearned a lot of urban warfare axioms and TTPs that were hard won in the Vietnam War, that had been lost over the preceding 30 years, basically. And so, or 25 plus years, a lot of things that we relearned there that I think helped contribute to the preparation of what we've done post 9/11, particularly in Iraq. A lot of the things that came out of Somalia helped shape the preheating of those kind of special operations missions there.
Yeah, well, there's no question about it that the tactics, obviously, like you said, that'd be what, 9 years later or 8 years later when Iraq and the GWAT officially gets underway. When you get to Somalia, how long did it take for things to start to get really hot? I mean, did you have a lot of experience getting involved with things pre-October 3rd, 1993? Or was that kind of the first time that you were really involved in hostilities?
No, we've been in a number of gunfights on a number of raids. In fact, I'd been out as a combat controller attached to the Rangers were doing some other things from an integration standpoint and support standpoint for our task force, which was a JSOC-led thing. And as the combat controller attached to the battalion commander and the other elements that he had moving around, I ended up doing foot patrols in the city with Rangers and going out on vehicle convoys. And sometimes the Rangers want to just go out and get it on, which means their rules of engagement were, Any technical, which was a crew-served weapon mounted on any vehicle in Somalia, was fair game. So, that becomes a weapons-free engagement. If you identify one of those vehicles, it's a militia vehicle, and bam, you can fire that thing up. So, I got to do some of that. And then we did a half a dozen raids or so before what happened on October 3rd that everybody knows as Black Hawk Down. So I'd been out in the city for a couple of months doing stuff, and I had a pretty good feel for it, at least as an outsider could in a city as complex and crowded as Mogadishu.
One of the guys I interviewed who was a ranger on the ground in Black Hawk Down, he said something to me that I've always found very interesting. I want to get your opinion on it. He says that he felt like he could tell things were ticking up over time and that there was eventually going to be a boiling point that was going to be reached. And he felt these little escalations, and then obviously October 3rd is when that, in his mind, that boiling point gets reached. Did you feel like things were getting increasingly harsher and more violent, or was it always kind of steady and the same for you?
I think there's no such thing as steady in a conflict. So I don't know that there's an equilibrium that exists like that. And I don't think that's part of any human experience at all. But to that guy's observation, I think that's an inevitability because both sides are trying to do something to the other side. The Somalis that knew we were out hunting them down, they developed very deliberately a tactic to try and shoot down a helicopter. And you know what? They were successful with that tactic. They didn't shoot down one helicopter on October 3rd. They shot down 4.
Right.
So his observation's correct in that sense, but I don't know that there was some sort of social upwelling or rising to a boiling point so much as we're moving forward and we're attacking them and they're trying to defend their leadership or their positions or their compounds. Yeah, I think things can escalate. But what was very different on October 3rd, and the reason it became, I think this is catalytic, was we did it during the day. In 1993, we're the only cats on the battlefield with night vision, and we used that very effectively back then. So the helicopter pilots are flying on MPGs, the guys are driving around MPGs, all of us are shooting on MPGs and walking around on MPGs. The enemy doesn't have any of that kind of capability. This mission was deliberately launched during the day because of the intel that triggered the mission. If these 3 conditions were met, then we can go do this mission. And then it becomes a commander's job, in this case, General Garrison's, decision and burden of responsibility to say, okay, we're going to take the gamble, we're going to roll the dice, throw them on the table, and we're going to do this thing because we think we can do it. And that's what we do, that nobody else can do that aggressively in an unconventional environment against an overwhelming enemy force. Man, it was an amazing group of people that prosecuted these missions. And I actually always have felt humbled that I got to be a part of that community and be one of those guys.
But just listening to the way you say that, you can see it's just so powerful to just hear you praise the guys you went there with, your teammates. Let's kind of get into the October 3rd angle of it all now. So are you in the helicopters that come in, or are you in the Humvees that come in?
I'm on the ground. So there were 4 combat controllers on the battlefield. There was a combat controller with the Ranger Vehicle Convoy, which is really our infill and exfil for certain conditions. October 3rd, for instance, the Delta Force guys came in on helicopter and we're going to come out on vehicle because that was much faster than trying to land helicopters and load them and expose those aircraft to enemy fire. So I was the guy on that place. There was a combat controller with the Ranger Blocking Force, which were the Rangers that came in by helicopter, fast rope in, and would cordon off sections of blocks or cities or buildings in order to contain that environment. Then there was a combat controller with the Delta Force Assaulters. That was Jeff Bray, which was the guy who replaced me because I had been with the Delta guys up previously to that point. And he's integrated with those guys whose job is to take down the guys we're actually there to capture. We're not really there to kill them. We're there to capture them if we can. Too much resistance, things go sideways. We're in a gunfight and you're a threat. We're gonna neutralize that threat, which is a clinical way of saying we're going to kill you. And then there was a combat controller on the combat search and rescue helicopter, the CSAR helicopter, which my best friend was Pat Rogers. And my 2 best friends in the world were on that CSAR helicopter. pararescueman Tim Wilkinson, who ultimately received an Air Force Cross, were both on the CSAR. So that's really the whole package too. And the mission that day was to go out, roll these guys up. There were about 12 of them in a meeting in a multi-story building right in the middle of downtown Mogadishu, man. And we were going to roll those guys up and then pull them out of there. And in fact, we did that. The mission from an operational standpoint, this is a really, really critical point, given the adverse press we received, was 100% successful. What we paid as a price was 18 lost Americans and 1,000, 2,000 Somalis. Nobody knows. We killed a lot of bad guys, or a lot of Somalis. I don't think all of them were bad, or even opposing, combat forces. But it was a 100% successful mission. We just paid a really steep price.
Well, I am so happy you mentioned that because I actually had this in my notes down the list, but I'm going to bring it up now because you brought it up. I heard you had a quote. I believe you were doing a podcast with Jared Taylor at Black Rifle Coffee, and you said, "We kicked ass. That mission is not a failure because 18 Americans died. We killed between 1,000 and 1,500 Somalis. I challenge any country in the world to put 200 guys in that position and not only have that mission be success. I challenge any other country to have one man walk out alive." And
yeah, I stand by that statement.
no, and that, to me, that quote was incredible because I think you're the first guy I've ever interviewed tied to Black Hawk Down who has been that open and direct about it. Like, yeah, we lost 18 guys, but we kicked ass. The mission itself was a success. Do you find people who disagree with that were there? Like, has that ever been a point of contention?
I suppose I've done a lot of interviews over the years, and I'm doing a lot of this thing takes on 30 years later, it still has a life. I get a lot of different interviews, and you get some pretty hard questions from people. But the people who disagree with me don't know what the hell they're talking about. So it's okay. I respect other people's opinions. But in this case, if you disagree with that statement, you don't actually know what you're talking about. And you weren't even there. So, what can you say?
No,
It was an amazing, it was such a fine collection of joint special operations capability for back then, man. This JSOC was still really coming into its own. And this is pre 9/11. Since 9/11, everybody in the bloody world who reads about military knows about JSOC. Back then, people didn't really know what it was. No one even knew the 24th existed, and we never even were allowed to talk about Delta Force. Well, shit, man, there's Delta Force books all over the place, and God knows how many SEAL books are out there. And so, like, everybody knows about those two units. My job as a writer, in this case, and a historian, I think in a very real sense, was to bring this third component that people have never heard of, who, by the way, are deadlier on a battlefield than any other individual, into the light of day. And I don't have the right to do that, but I felt I had the obligation, and that's what I've been doing since I started the process of writing Alone at Dawn.
Yeah, and we're going to get in for the viewers at home. Obviously, you've heard on this podcast before about John Chapman. We are going to get into Alone at Dawn here in a little bit. When everything starts popping off on October 3rd and the first helicopter gets hit, now is the first helicopter that gets hit the one that goes down? Because you said 4 were hit total.
Yeah.
Is the first one hit one that becomes one of the rescue sites that
Yes.
they pivot to?
It's really the primary rescue site in the sense that that's where most of the effort and manpower and firepower went, because it was piloted by a guy named Cliff Walcott. Everybody called the Velvet Elvis, and he was a remarkable pilot. Of course, he had to be, because he was a Task Force 160th guy, but he was also really one of the primary drivers of developing the DAP. We don't have to dig into that, but it's this conversion of a 60 into something that's more than just a transport. Anyway, that helicopter got shot down. I didn't actually see it crash, because when it crashed, I was dragging a SEAL down the street who'd been shot. I ran down to get him, and it just happened to happen at the same time. So I was dragging him back to friendly lines when the helicopter actually crashed. I knew it crashed because I'm monitoring all the comms. But that helicopter went down. There were 2 more helicopters that really got hit, one of which crashed in the city, which had Michael Durant on it, right, and his crew, which is where the 2 Delta Force snipers, Gary Gordon and Randy Shugart, went in and so rightfully earned their medals of honor. But Michael Durant's the only guy who survived there. The two other helicopters who got hit that crashed actually flew all the way back to the airport and made it to friendly lines. In essence, that included the CSAR helicopter. That helicopter, when it got hit by an RPG in the tail boom, the guys were fast roping down the fast ropes. My best friend was still on a fast rope when that thing got hit. And that pilot, Dan Gelada, another remarkably dedicated and capable and heroic American, guy was so cool on the stick, man. You can see it in the video footage. The helicopter gets hit, it shudders, and he starts to lift off because he needs to get the hell out of there. And the guys in the back are like, hey, there's still guys on fast ropes. He settled back down, held that hover until the last guy was clear. Then they cut the ropes and then he split. Again, there's just so many countless examples of heroism I'd love to share with you. Dan's just one of them. And Tim Wilkinson, Air Force Cross recipient, one of my jokes with Tim, it's always been, I like to give him a lot of grief about this, is in the middle of the biggest gunfight, after that helicopter inserted them and everybody's coalescing around Cliff Walcott's crashed helicopter, and he's dead, but he's still inside and they're trying to recover his body. That became the anchor point. But this is a big intersection there, and people are getting shot on either side. And the only other PJ had been shot, so he's immobilized. And Tim's really the primary medic. And he ran across this major intersection 3 times to get fluids and other, medical supplies to treat guys on each side. The only reason that guy lived through that and has partially contributed to his receiving the Air Force Cross is he runs so slow, but his arms move so fast that all the Somalis, I think, were leading him by too much, and he didn't get shot because he looks like he's running really fast, but that guy is a very slow runner. I can attest to that personally. But to run across that intersection 3 times, man, and you say these cliches like "cover me," like that's going to happen. There's 1,000 Somalis shooting. The list goes on about heroism that day, and I think that's why it still captures the public's fascination, and also the whole 100 guys on the ground against a city of 1 million people is becomes something, not a cliche, because I don't want to diminish any of that, but people can't really grasp that, and that's really the reality.
How long did it take for someone to get on a radio to where you are or where the Rangers you're with are and kind of explain, like, we need to pivot what we're doing to get to these crash sites? Was it immediate? Was there because the film kind of depicts it like there was a period of time where there's a lot of confusion, and I'm just curious, was it really quick? How long did it take to be like, we got to try to get to these crash sites?
Well, everybody's always on the radio all the time, so it's not like somebody got on the radio.
Right.
There's a lot of different. The difference between a movie and reality is when you're prosecuting a mission like that on that day, there's like 35 key people. Each one of those people is essential to what's happening. In a movie, you can't really follow 35 characters, so they distill it down into like 3 to 5 super characters who do all these amazing things, and that allows the audience to follow the story. But in reality, those things are all happening simultaneously with a lot of people. And even me, as one of the I was as integrated as anybody on that battlefield, communication-wise. All the combat controllers are. That's our job. I'm listening to the C2. I'm listening to the Rangers on their inner team. I'm listening to the Delta Force guys. I'm listening to the helicopters. I'm listening to the helicopter inner team frequency where they're talking amongst themselves, but I'm also talking air to ground to those guys. There's a lot of complexity involved just in the communication architecture on a thing like that. All those things are happening at once. The confusion that you're referencing that comes and introduces itself into any battle like this is when something goes sideways, everybody starts talking at once. Everybody's trying to do something, including the leadership back at the rear, which is one of the problems with persistent ISR. We'll put that aside for now, because the guys who know what's going on are the guys on the ground more than anybody else. But leadership wants to help. So it takes a little while, even amongst professionals, for reality and the correct plan to manifest itself. It just takes time. And in this case, one helicopter goes down. 20 minutes later, another helicopter is going down. A third helicopter's been shot. It's crashing back at the base, controlled crashing. It lands and it makes an auto rotation. That's a lot of moving parts. And we're losing vehicles on the street. You know, we rolled out with 11 vehicles total. And then a couple vehicles, Hummers, peeled off, and we had some really severely wounded guys in the early part of the battle. So now we're down to like 9 vehicles, and we left 2 of those on the streets. I don't mean like we pulled over and parked. They were destroyed by rocket-propelled grenades and enemy fire to the point they were non-operable. So there's a lot of chaos involved. And by the way, that movie does a pretty good job of conveying what I felt was very graphically real chaos. It's a very realistic movie. I've only ever seen it twice, but or mostly twice. I saw it 1.5 times, I think.
One of my questions for you is, well, first, let me ask you this, because I guess now I'm trying to because I know some guys got back to the hangar, they reloaded.
Yeah, I did.
Yeah, so that's what I was going to ask. Were you part of the crew that went back and then went back into the streets?
Yeah, well, everybody who wasn't locked in at the crashed site with Cliff Walcott, the CSAR guys, a bunch of Rangers, a bunch of Delta Force dudes, went back to the hangar. Everything that was on the convoy, which included some of the Delta Force operators who had been inserted by Fast Rope, because we brought the enemy guys that were our targets out on 5-ton trucks. Well, 1 5-ton truck. We lost a 5-ton truck in the battle. Everybody went back to the hangar. And at that point, you're rearming and refitting and getting ready to roll back out, because that's what you have to do.
So that leads me to the next thing. So now you said there's a total of 4 combat controllers involved. Are all 4, do all 4 survive the battle, and are all 4 alive? Okay, so
not this is all 4 are not alive today, but all 4 guys survived the battle. Only 2 of us are alive now.
So this is where my mind, as someone who has no idea what it's like, it becomes very confusing. We've got 4 guys who are the best of the best of the best when it comes to controlling the airspace. Who is making the decisions between you 4 if there's a disagreement over where you're sending the air power, if there's 4 of you out there?
That's a great question, but it doesn't quite unfold that way. When it comes to combat controllers in a battlefield, and any complex battlefield with multiple moving parts that all have combat controllers, and Taker Gar, the Battle of Roberts Ridge, where John Chapman earned his Medal of Honor, is another example of this. There was a half a dozen combat controllers all over behind the enemy lines, with Delta Force, the SAS, SEAL Team 6, the CSAR packages. So, you know, this happens regularly. So back to your question, though. How do those guys determine who's going to do what? That's why they're professionals, man. We do that. We self-organize on a battlefield in a way that most people that we even support have no clue what we're doing. They have no clue we're doing this at the same time. So, for instance, on that day, I did not call gun run like airstrikes from Little Birds or DABs, because I felt incorrectly, as it turns out, but that's a gunfight, that on the vehicle convoy where I had Mark 19s and M2 50 caliber machine guns, that we had heavy weapons, the heaviest weapons we had on the ground, that where that air power needed to be was over where Jeff Bray was, which was at Cliff Walcott's crash site. And he was doing that. And so now at this point, 3 combat controllers are all converged in the vicinity of that crash. 2 are together, Jeff Bray and Pat Rogers, and John McGarry, the 4th guy that was out there, was with the Rangers in the gunfight. So at this point, who's the guy who should be doing this? Those guys agreed amongst themselves that should be Jeff. Not because he's better than the other guys. They're all equally good. It's just that he rolled in with Delta, he was in that position, and he was the right guy. And you know what? The gun runs he did with Little Birds, and you have to credit the Little Bird pilots with actually engaging the targets, but Jeff is the guy telling them, you can shoot here, you can't shoot there. And he's calling in gun runs, can't even make this up, 10 feet from his position, 10 feet, 3 meters from his position, other side of the wall. And those pilots are so good, and the communication ability between that guy in the cockpit and that combat controller on the ground is so strong and precise that you can do that. That's why nobody else can do what we do. And so, meanwhile, I'm on the convoy from hell and we're getting the shit shot out of us. And we are trying to get to those guys until such a point as we were running out of ammo. I was taking ammo from wounded and dead guys. I had run out of ammo pretty early on, not because I was shooting a lot, because I didn't carry that much ammunition. Because as my strategy back in those days was, I carried 3 magazines of 5.56, 100% tracer. Because in the middle of a daylight gunfight, if I want to mark a target for a little bird gunship, everybody else is shooting 1 to 5, 1 to 3. If I shoot 100% tracer, I can shoot at something while I'm talking to the pilot and go, see all those tracers?
Yeah,
That's me. And that differentiates my bullets from everybody else. And I don't have a laser in the day, and little bird pilots can't use that. So, but the point was, I felt that if things really went sideways, I'm going to be on the radio so much, I'm not going to be shooting at bad guys. But this was such an extreme situation, man. I was shooting people. And so we all rolled back because we were running out of vehicles, we were running out of people, and we were running out of ammo. So the decision was made by leadership that we got to get back to base. So those of us on the convoy rolled back in to base, refitted, rearmed, and prepped to go back out to rescue the rest of our guys. And there was zero doubt that's what we were going to do. And that's what we did.
It's just unbelievable to hear. I'm 30 years old. I can't imagine when you get back to that hangar and you said we're resupplying. Is it get your hands on as much ammunition as you can fit in the vehicles? Like, is that the mentality that's going on?
That's part of the mentality. There's a lot of mentality involved in this. You know, it's a mistake to try and bend things into smaller little segments, because there's a lot of moving parts. And physiologically and emotionally and psychologically, everybody's going through different experiences. I will tell you, I had a very surreal experience back at the hangar. We rolled up, we're taking wounded and dead guys out of vehicles. We're all helping with that. There's blood on everything. My vehicle is just shot to shit. And I think my vehicle didn't go back out. I got in another vehicle. I can't even believe we got our vehicle back to base. But I went into the hangar, which was what housed the whole task force, which was about 400 people with support. And it was a ghost town inside that hangar. And the hangar was never a ghost town. And I'm sitting there with a SEAL friend of mine, one of the other guys who had been out with me, and we both came back. I went and got every magazine I had, which was like 11 or 13 magazines, I don't remember. And I'm loading all of them. And he's loading all his magazines, because I'm already, as a combat controller, I'm carrying more weight than anybody else in the battlefield. All the radios, all the batteries, plus what everybody else always carries, that's what I'm carrying. So everybody else has got running gear and ammo, and they're carrying a, 25-pound load. And I've got like 75 pounds I've got to haul around with me everywhere I go. So I get new batteries, all that sort of stuff, but we're loading ammo. And I remember we were just sitting there quietly, and I looked at Homer, and I'm like, man, I don't want to go back out there. And he goes, I don't want to go back out there either. Yeah, you go back to loading ammo, because we're going to go back out there. My two best friends are out there. Well, whether they're out there or not is immaterial. I'm going back out there because that's my job, man. And these are the best trained people in the world, and they just will do anything for you. And that's a great testament to that type of community. And I think it's also an American trait.
It's nothing short of incredible. Like you were saying, you're getting shot to shit, driving back and forth. It's a city of 1 million people against 100, 200 Americans. How difficult is it? And this is something that has always fascinated me. How difficult is it, especially now that the Hornet's nest has been kicked, the gunfight is underway, helicopters are down. When you're going back out there, how do you know who's a good guy and who's a bad guy? They're not wearing military uniforms like it's World War II. And like you said, the whole city is armed to the teeth. So
they're angry.
And they're angry.
Are angry people now.
So how do you determine hostile intent versus that's just a dude, I don't know what he's doing?
Well, the Hornet's nest metaphor is really apropos here, because that's exactly what happened. And it's a human dynamic, and psychology now is in motion. And people are you in the West, in the United States, a big gunfight breaks out. You wouldn't expect everyone to converge there, especially like there's a lot of stuff going on. Helicopters are shooting, like there's stuff everywhere. And people were converging. It's an individual dilemma and choice and gray area when you get involved in situations like this to engage targets. Early on in the gunfight, I stopped engaging anyone at 100 meters, even if I saw them out there with a gun, because there was just too damn many people. And I only wanted to shoot people close to me. And I was busy talking anyway. But, you know, you're going to have to make a decision. If you see a lady holding a baby, pointing out very clearly to somebody else who's in defilade or masked otherwise where your position is, what do you do about that? It's an open-ended question. I'm not going to answer it because every situation is different. You can't categorize it and say, I'm going to shoot that lady every time, because that's simply not true. But when are you going to engage that target becomes a question you have to face. And there was some of that going on that day. I didn't experience it that way. I don't think so. I don't think I shot and killed anybody that wasn't actually shooting at us. Sadly, I missed the guy who shot me. Son of a bitch. I really wanted to shoot that guy, but I missed. I didn't. Well, I got hit. I looked down immediately because you get hit. But the first thing I should have done was shoot the guy. By the time I looked up, he was gone. So,
where were you hit on your body?
a round came through my supposedly 7.62 rated door, which it wasn't. That's one of those government lowest bidder cliches. So I was shot in the foot and the chest, but I had body armor on, and that bullet that came through hit me in the foot just had enough energy to get through the door, but not enough energy to penetrate my boot. Now that's a very fine, narrow physics calculation there at 2,900 feet per second to get through a door, but not your boot. Anyway, that's, neither here nor there. It was just part of the entire experience of what you're doing out there. I mean, to combat that is after that happened, we roll up past an alleyway. I'd unpin a frag grenade and throw it out down the alley because you throw something out there and it goes off. I'm not really worried about hitting somebody. I just don't want them to come out and shoot at us.
Right. No, that makes perfect sense. Was there any moment that you look back to on that day, 30 years later, coming up on the 30-year anniversary here in the fall, where you just thought, man, in that moment, I really didn't think I was making it out alive? Was it when you got hit in the chest? Was there any other moment where you're like, we are not getting out of this? Or were you always doing your best to kind of remain as optimistic as you possibly could?
I think almost everybody goes through a range of emotions because you have to realize it wasn't a moment. It's an 18-hour gunfight, man. That's a lot of moments. If you divide that by minutes or seconds, that's a lot of moments. And so for me, I went through a range of emotions depending on what I was doing and what I wasn't doing. Gunfights have peaks and lulls. They follow curves. There's things happening and there's not things happening. People get tired. People have to take a leak. People have to get something to drink. Those are happening on a gunfight, a long gunfight. Short, high intensity gunfights where you roll on an objective and you overwhelm the enemy and you kill them and you do whatever. Okay, not in that case, but in longer protracted fights, what happens is there's a natural rhythm that just unfolds. You can't characterize it, you can't plan it. So, there were times I just was waiting for my turn. Everybody in my vehicle got shot except for the driver, I think, and our interpreter, who was in the fetal position, curled up in the back. And, or he might have got shot too. I don't know. I don't remember anymore. So I was waiting for my turn to get shot. And even though I'd been shot, I'm like, I'm just waiting for my turn to get shot where I get killed or I'm going to bleed really bad. And other times I was really angry. And other times I was really determined. It just depends on where you were. There were times like, this is what we're going to do and this is how it's going to go. And other times when you realize I am not in control of the entire environment I am in. And even my destiny is completely out of my hands. There's some real existential realization that comes with that if you think about them. I tend to think about those things a lot philosophically, and just waiting for my turn to get shot. I'm not passively sitting there. I'm shooting people who are a problem. I'm doing what I need to do because my job is to get where we're going to go to the best I can. I was helping to lead the convoy for a while there with the helos to go to the crash site. Anyway, we were sort of wandering around the answer to your question, but I don't think you can look at something like an 18-hour gunfight and go, well, there was a point, and that point remains this one single thing, because you're going to come back to that same psychological point probably multiple times.
No, that's a better explanation than I could have come up with, and that is a great way of looking at it. Do you remember what you were thinking when the whole situation was finally over? You're back at the hangar. It would now be what? It would have been early morning, October 4th, maybe around
No,
9
I didn't
a.m.
get back till noon. I was in the very
Okay.
last. I was in the very back of the very last vehicle. So the rest of the strike force had already or arrived back at the base by helicopter. Those of us on the vehicle convoy had to wind our way not straight through the city, but we had to go back from a staging area, which was a sports stadium that was occupied by the Pakistani peacekeepers. I didn't get back till noon. We started at 3 o'clock one day, and I really got back at noonish the next day. And but what was I thinking? Man, at that point, there's a lot of things going through your mind. We're missing people. So the first thing that you're thinking about is, okay, I gotta refit again. Battery, ammo, that for me, those are those things. Get something to drink, get something to eat. You got to sustain yourself. And then we're poised to go back out there, and you're thinking about all of these things and the experiences you've just had and what you think that next experience is going to look like. What are the conditions and how can I apply my skills and what I need to do? At some point there, they came back and said, we're standing down. And, the helicopter pilot's been flying nonstop, go pills, all the operators, all of us have been doing this thing nonstop. And even a 19-year-old Ranger is going to have to sleep at some point. And those guys are used to going without sleep, man. But the fact is at some point we just crashed. So I know I crashed out for a few hours. So I wasn't really thinking anything like you're talking about until much later in the day. And then I went out and sat, I had a cigar with my friend Tim Wilkinson, and we went out and started, you start processing the experiences you've just had. And you know what's universal about that is there's no difference in a very real way from being the survivor of an attack, like a criminal attack or even a car crash. Traumatic experiences that have a major effect on your body and psychology all tend to start to manifest themselves in a very similar way. I have since learned and spent a lot of time on it. I've even written books about it.
Oh, so I'm literally at a loss for words because I can promise you I would be panicking and freaking out, or at least I think I would be. You talk about it, very calmly, and it's very impressive. One question I always get when I tell people I'm interviewing from someone from Black Hawk Down, without fail, they always ask me, you got to ask, and I'm curious to get your opinion on it. Some people who fought in Black Hawk Down, political people, American citizens, they always have argued, some of them, not all of them, if only we would have had tanks, if only we would have had planes. And I've heard some Black Hawk Downs veterans say that's an unfair thing to lob into the discussion about what could have, should have, would have happened. You personally, do you look back and say this could have been avoided with if only we'd done X, Y, and Z, or to you, do you think that's not a fair characterization?
If you untangle any major airplane crash with a commercial carrier, which is a big disaster, 200 people died, plane crashes on the ground. If you remove one of 9 key elements in that convergence of events in time and space that led to that crash, the crash doesn't happen. So you can always go back and say, well, in retrospection, A would have led to Z. But that's complete bullshit, man, because A only ever leads to B, and B is so many complex variables, you can't get to Z and follow a chain of logic or decision making. Now, that's on one hand. The other hand is we were hobbled by politics. Bill Clinton as the president and Les Aspin as the Secretary of Defense, they had really weighed in on this. Like, we want a very small profile. We don't want to be freaking people out. We're sending all these secret special ops guys to hunt people down in an African country. So when we were first looking for gunship, AC-130 gunship support, the answer was no, you can't have one of those. So we didn't get one of those. Now, some guys hang a lot of weight on having that on the battlefield or a tank. But both of those platforms, while bringing disproportionately larger firepower, 105 millimeter cannons in both cases, really, can't move a tank around dirt streets and narrow alleyways That thing's a boat anchor. If you haven't even trained with that to get that tank crew up to speed to react the way you do as a special operations force, which are very rapid decision making, very rapid course taking, and then implementing of that action, that's not going to do you any good. And an AC-130 gunship, powerful and wonderful as they are, and I love AC-130 gunships. I've got great friends who are, air crew on gunships. I can't put any round off an AC-130 gunship of any variety, from an A to a Q model, and put it around within 10 feet of my position. So its ability to do certain things, move crowds back and engage crowds that are converging on me when they're 300 meters away. Yep, I can do that. Maybe not with a 105, but he can put a 20 or 40 millimeter round onto those problems, and that's going to at least disperse that. But most of what happened in Somalia was very personal gunfighting. When you're anchored around a spot and people are shooting at you, and you own a corner of one building and a fuselage of a helicopter in the street, that's not a lot of terrain. So you're not really looking 200 meters away, or even really 100 meters away. You're looking at 100 feet. 100 feet's a long distance in that gunfight.
Again, I hate to be repetitive, but it's fascinating to just hear your perspective on these issues when I've heard it from other people. And it's just, I don't want to fanboy. It's just crazy.
Well, one of the things though, that's my perspective is different because I am a combat controller. Guys who have been out in gunfights, infantry, or doesn't matter, ODA guys or SEALs, doesn't matter. Really competent people, they don't have the sophistication to slice that in narrower increments to understand the limitations as well as the applications of airborne firepower. That's what we do better than anybody in the world. And it's one of the reasons I make this statement all the time. And it's not about other people aren't capable, but the fact is the deadliest individual to walk a battlefield in 60,000 years of human warfare is a combat controller, because that guy can kill more enemy on a battlefield than anybody else using the fused power, the fusion of that guy on the ground with that cockpit in the air, that capability, better than anybody else. Here's a story I'll share with you. Will Markham, who's retired Chief Master Sergeant Combat Controller, went over the border post 9/11 with the first ODA to go into Afghanistan, one of the two first ODAs. In his first 26 days of combat, he killed more people on the battlefield than any SEAL in the history of SEALs, ever. And you know what? It was his first trip in combat. He did 11 deployments. So that guy on the battlefield is the modern incarnation of an asymmetrical advantage. Because it's not about how many guys you can put in the gunfight. That's one man, one bullet, shooting one man, one bullet. I'm only engaging if I got to shoot you, David, I got to make a kinetic connection, point right through my camera, right at you, and connect the barrel of my rifle to you. Telemetry and wind, all that shit. But I can only shoot you one guy at a time. Even
Right.
crucible weapon, I'm just shooting this few guys. You want to decimate the enemy, you've got to bring in air power. And so the ability to do that, that's why in the modern battlefield, what you see is so important. Anyway.
Well, I do want to now get into Alone at Dawn, which is the story of John Chapman. I interviewed a guy by the name of Alan Mack, who was the pilot.
He's an amazing, amazing human and an amazing pilot. There's another guy from that same unit, Dan Gelada and Cliff Walcott. That guy's name, it resides on that list of world's greatest helicopter pilots. Anyway, I don't mean to digress, but I'm a huge fan of Alan Mack.